Dr. Emma Thompson sank into her first-class seat with a deep sigh of relief. Her whole body ached from standing for 18 long hours in the operating room. She had just saved the life of a young mother who had been rushed to the hospital with a failing heart. Emma's skilled hands had worked through the night, carefully repairing the damaged organ with precision that only came from years of experience. Now, as she settled into the comfortable leather seat, Emma allowed herself a moment to close her tired eyes. The plane was slowly filling with passengers, and she was grateful for the chance to rest before her important medical conference in London. She had been invited to receive a special award for her volunteer work, something that meant more to her than any amount of money ever could. Emma had grown up in a small town where opportunities were scarce, especially for someone who looked like her. Her parents had worked multiple jobs just to put food on the table, but they had always encouraged her dreams of becoming a doctor. Through countless nights of studying, scholarships, and determination, she had made it through medical school and specialized in cardiac surgery. The plane continued to fill with passengers. Emma watched as families settled in with their children. Business people organized their laptops, and elderly couples helped each other with their carry-on bags. She loved observing people and imagining their stories. It reminded her why she had chosen to dedicate her life to helping others. Then Margaret Wilson appeared in the aisle. She was a well-dressed woman in her 50s, wearing expensive jewelry and carrying a designer handbag. Margaret moved with the confidence of someone who was used to getting her way in life. She had been flying first class for 20 years and considered it her rightful place. When Margaret saw Emma sitting in seat 2A, she stopped dead in her tracks, her perfectly made-up face twisted with confusion and then anger. This was not what she expected to see in first class. In her mind, certain types of people belonged in certain places, and Emma did not fit her idea of who should be sitting in the premium section. "Excuse me," Margaret said loudly, her voice cutting through the gentle hum of conversation in the cabin. "I think there's been a mistake. This is first class." Emma opened her eyes and looked up at the woman standing in the aisle. She had encountered this type of situation before, though it never became easier to handle. With the patience she had learned from years of dealing with difficult patients and their families, Emma responded calmly. "Yes, I know this is first class. This is my seat." She reached into her purse and pulled out a boarding pass, showing it to Margaret with a polite smile. Emma hoped this would be the end of the confrontation, but she sensed it would not be that simple. Margaret barely glanced at the boarding pass. Her mind was already made up. She looked round the cabin until she spotted James, a young flight attendant who was helping another passenger with their luggage. Margaret waved him over with an imperious gesture. There must be some error, Margaret insisted when James approached. "She can't possibly afford to be here. Someone like her belongs in the back of the plane." The words hit Emma like a punch to the stomach. She had heard variations of this same statement throughout her life, but they never stopped hurting. Each time, she felt the same mix of anger, sadness, and determination. She had worked twice as hard as her peers to get where she was, and yet people like Margaret still questioned her right to be there. Around them, other passengers began to notice the commotion. A teenage boy named Tom, who was traveling alone to visit his grandmother, watched with wide eyes. He had been raised to believe that all people were equal. But he was witnessing something that challenged that belief. An elderly gentleman named William shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering stories his own father had told him about darker times in history. Emma's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. Years of working in high-pressure situations had taught her to control her emotions even when everything inside her wanted to scream. She kept her voice steady and professional. "I paid for this seat, just like everyone else," Emma said clearly. "I'm a doctor, and I'm traveling to receive an award for my volunteer work." Margaret's voice grew even louder, drawing more attention from the surrounding passengers. "I don't care what you claim to be. People like you don't belong in first class. I want her moved to coach immediately." The cabin fell completely silent. Emma felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every judgment being passed on her. She had dedicated her entire life to helping others, regardless of their background, race, or ability to pay. She had saved countless lives, worked in free clinics, and volunteered in underserved communities. Now, she was being judged solely by the color of her skin. But Emma Thompson was not just any woman. She was a fighter who had overcome poverty, discrimination, and countless obstacles to become one of the country's most respected surgeons. She had earned her place in that seat through hard work, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to helping others. She would not be moved from her rightfully purchased seat, no matter how loud Margaret's protests became. The tension in the first-class cabin had become so thick that it felt like everyone was holding their breath. Passengers who had been quietly reading books or checking their phones now found themselves unwilling witnesses to something that made them deeply uncomfortable. Each person in the cabin was wrestling with their own thoughts about what they were seeing and whether they should do something about it. Tom Williams sat in his window seat, his 16-year-old heart pounding in his chest. He was traveling alone for the first time, on his way to visit his grandmother in London. She had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was small, and she had filled his head with stories about standing up for what was right. His grandmother had lived through difficult times and had always told him that good people must speak up when they see injustice. But this was different from the stories she told him. This was happening right in front of him, and he could feel his stomach churning with nervousness. He wanted to say something to help the kind-looking doctor, but his mouth felt dry and his hands were shaking. What if he said the wrong thing? What if he made it worse? What if the angry woman turned on him next, across the aisle? William Peterson was having his own internal struggle. The 73-year-old retired teacher had spent his entire career working with children from all backgrounds. He had seen firsthand how prejudice could damage young minds and had dedicated his life to teaching tolerance and understanding. His own father had told him stories about the dark days of segregation, about how good people had stayed silent while terrible things happened. William had promised himself long ago that he would never stay silent if he witnessed such treatment. He had imagined himself as someone who would always do the right thing when the moment came. But now that the moment was actually here, he felt frozen in his seat. His body felt heavy, and doubt crept into his mind. Was it really his place to get involved? Would his words make any difference? James Mitchell, the 25-year-old flight attendant, was caught in an impossible position. He had been working for the airline for 3 years and had been trained to handle difficult situations with passengers. The company policy was clear about treating all passengers with respect. But he had never encountered anything quite like this. He could see the hurt in Emma's eyes and knew that what Margaret was doing was wrong. But he also worried about making the situation worse. James had grown up in a small town where everyone looked like him, and he had never really thought much about racism until he started working for the airline. Now he was seeing it up close, and it made him feel sick to his stomach. He knew he needed to do something, but his training had not prepared him for this level of open discrimination. Meanwhile, Margaret Wilson continued her attack, her voice becoming shriller with each word. She seemed to feed off the attention she was getting, and her accusations became more outrageous. "I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this," she declared, waving her hands dramatically. She's probably using a stolen credit card or something. Check her identification again. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some tried to look away, focusing on their magazines or phones, hoping the situation would resolve itself. Others watched with open curiosity, as if they were watching a television show rather than a real person being humiliated. Emma Thompson remained remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, though anyone looking closely could see that her hands trembled slightly as she held her boarding pass. She had faced this kind of treatment before in her career, but it never got easier. Each incident was like a fresh wound, reminding her of how far society still had to go. She thought about all the patients she had saved, all the families she had comforted, all the lives she had touched through her work, and wondered why none of that seemed to matter to people like Margaret. The cabin had divided into different groups without anyone realizing it. Some passengers looked uncomfortable and wished they were anywhere else. Others seemed to agree with Margaret's assessment, nodding along with her complaints. A few appeared genuinely confused about what was happening, and sure of who to believe or what to think. But something beautiful was building in the silence. Sometimes it takes just one person to stand up for what is right, to inspire others to find their courage. Sometimes all it takes is for someone to break the spell of fear and inaction that keeps good people frozen in their seats. The moment was approaching when someone would find the strength to speak up. The question was who it would be and what they would say. Would it be the nervous teenager who had been taught to fight for justice? Would it be the elderly teacher who had promised himself he would never stay silent? Would it be the young flight attendant who knew right from wrong? Or would it be someone else entirely? The cabin held its breath, waiting for someone to break the silence and stand up for what was right. The tension was building toward a breaking point, and everyone could feel that something was about to change. William Peterson had been sitting in his seat for what felt like hours, listening to Margaret's cruel words and watching Emma's dignified response. The 73-year-old man had taught school for over 40 years, and in that time, he had seen the best and worst of human nature. He had watched children learn to accept differences and had also seen how prejudice could poison young minds. His own father had lived through a time when such treatment was common, and William had grown up hearing stories about the importance of speaking up when others were being treated unfairly. Something inside William finally snapped. He could not sit there any longer and watch this kind woman be humiliated simply because of the color of her skin. His weathered hands gripped the armrest tightly as he slowly pushed himself up from his seat. His knees creaked from arthritis, but his resolve was stronger than his physical discomfort. "Ma'am," William said to Margaret, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades of experience, "I think you're mistaken. This young woman has every right to be here, just like you and me." Margaret spun round, her face red with anger and surprise. She had not expected anyone to challenge her, especially not an elderly white man who looked like he came from her own generation. "Mind your own business, old man," she snapped. "This doesn't concern you." But William's courage had created a spark that jumped to young Tom Williams. The 16-year-old had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, remembering every lesson his grandmother had taught him about standing up for what was right. His heart was pounding, and his palms were sweaty, but he could not ignore the voice in his head that sounded exactly like his grandmother. Tom stood up from his window seat, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. His voice trembled as he spoke, but his words were clear and determined. "Actually, it does concern all of us. My grandmother always taught me that silence in the face of injustice makes us part of the problem." Emma Thompson looked at both men with tears forming in her eyes. For the past 20 minutes, she had been fighting this battle alone, maintaining her composure while being attacked by a complete stranger. She had felt isolated and vulnerable, wondering if anyone else in the cabin cared about what was happening to her. Now, two strangers were standing up for her, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the airplane's heating system. The courage shown by William and Tom seemed to unlock something in the other passengers. A middle-aged woman named Lucy, who had been watching the scene with growing disgust, finally found her voice. "I agree with them," she said firmly. "This is wrong, and we all know it." A businessman named David, who had been trying to focus on his laptop but found himself unable to concentrate, looked up and nodded his support. "Ma'am, your behavior is inappropriate and unwelcome here," he said to Margaret. "This doctor has done nothing wrong." More voices joined in. An elderly woman named Ruth said, "I'm ashamed to see this kind of treatment in this day and age." A young mother named Helen, who was traveling with her toddler, spoke up as well. "What kind of example are we setting for our children when we allow this to happen?" James Mitchell, the flight attendant, had been watching the situation develop with growing concern. He had been trained to handle difficult passengers, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this level of open discrimination. The support from the other passengers gave him the confidence he needed to take action. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson," James said, his voice professional but firm, "but I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. Dr. Thompson's ticket is valid, and she has every right to be here." Margaret looked round the cabin with wild eyes, suddenly realizing that the tide had turned completely against her. The unity of the other passengers was powerful and undeniable. She had expected support for her position, or at least silence from the other travelers instead. She found herself facing a wall of disapproval and condemnation. I want to speak to the captain," Margaret stammered, her earlier confidence crumbling like a house of cards. Her voice had lost its sharp edge, and she seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the rejection of her fellow passengers. "That can be arranged," James replied professionally. "But first, please return to your seat and allow Dr. Thompson to travel in peace." For the first time since the confrontation began, Emma smiled. It was not a smile of triumph or revenge, but rather one of gratitude and relief. She had spent so much of her life fighting battles alone, from her childhood in poverty, to her struggles in medical school, to her daily work as one of the few black cardiac surgeons in the country. But in this moment, surrounded by strangers who had chosen to stand up for what was right, she felt less alone than she had in years. The cabin had transformed from a place of tension and division into something approaching her. Community people who had been strangers minutes before were now united in their support for basic human dignity and respect. Captain Robert Hayes had been flying commercial airliners for over 25 years. And in that time, he had seen almost everything. He had dealt with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, and weather delays. But the call he had just received from his crew was different. James had explained the situation in the first-class cabin, and Captain Hayes knew he needed to handle this personally. The distinguished man in his 50s made his way through the airplane, his uniform crisp and his bearing confident. He had always believed that his aircraft was like a small community in the sky, and he would not tolerate discrimination or harassment under his command. As he approached the first-class cabin, he could feel the tension in the air. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who was used to being in charge. Margaret immediately launched into her complaints, her words tumbling out in a rush. She told him about how she had been flying first class for 20 years, how she had never seen anything like this before, and how she was certain there had been some kind of mistake with the seating assignments. Her voice was shrill and desperate, as if she knew her position was weakening but could not stop herself from continuing. Captain Hayes raised his hand to stop her mid-sentence. He had heard enough to understand what was really happening. "Mom, I need to inform you that your behavior is unacceptable. Dr. Thompson is a valued passenger, and she has every right to be here." "Doctor," Margaret scoffed, her voice dripping with disbelief. "She's probably lying about that too." That was when Tom Williams found his voice again. The 16-year-old had been quiet since his initial brave stand, but Margaret's continued. Attacks on Emma's character triggered something deep inside him. His voice filled with emotion as he spoke. "She's not lying," Tom said, his words carrying across the cabin. "I recognize her from the news. Dr. Emma Thompson saved my little sister's life last year. She had a heart defect, and Dr. Thompson performed the surgery for free because my family couldn't afford it." The cabin fell completely silent. Even the background hum of the airplane engine seemed to fade away as the weight of Tom's words settled over everyone. Margaret's face went pale, and she seemed to shrink into herself. William Peterson, who had been the first to stand up for Emma, added his own testimony. "My grandson mentioned a Dr. Thompson who saved his friend's life. She volunteers at the Children's Hospital every weekend, operating on kids whose families can't pay." Emma Thompson's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and amazement. She had never expected her work to be recognized in such a way, especially not by strangers on an airplane. She had always believed that helping others was simply the right thing to do, not something that deserved special recognition. Captain Hayes continued, his respect for Emma clear in his voice. "Dr. Thompson is traveling to London to receive the International Humanitarian Award for her volunteer work. She has provided free heart surgeries to over 500 children in underserved communities around the world." James, the flight attendant, had done some research on his tablet after the captain arrived. "She's also written 3 books on pediatric cardiac surgery and donated all the profits to charity." He added, "She's considered one of the leading experts in her field." Other passengers began to share what they knew. Lucy, the middle-aged woman who had spoken up earlier, said, "I read about her in a magazine. She spends her vacations traveling to poor countries to perform surgeries on children who would otherwise die." David, the businessman, looked up from his phone. "I just found an article about her. She's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times for her humanitarian work." Margaret looked round the cabin, seeing the respect and admiration in everyone's eyes as they looked at Emma. She began to realize the magnitude of her mistake. Here was a woman who had dedicated her entire life to helping others, and Margaret had attacked her based on nothing more than the color of her skin. I didn't know," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. All the fight had gone out of her, and she seemed to collapse in on herself. Emma Thompson, displaying the grace that had defined her entire life, spoke softly. Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced discrimination many times before. "You didn't need to know my profession or my achievements to treat me with basic human dignity. Every person deserves that, regardless of their background." The simple truth of Emma's words hit everyone in the cabin like a physical blow. She was right. Of course, a person's worth was not determined by their job title or their accomplishments, but by their basic humanity. Margaret had failed to see Emma as a human being deserving of respect, and that failure had led to this painful confrontation. The cabin remained quiet as everyone absorbed what had just happened. They had witnessed not just discrimination, but also the power of standing up for what was right. They had seen how one person's courage could inspire others to find their own voice. The silence in the cabin was profound and heavy. Margaret Wilson sat in her seat with her face buried in her hands, feeling the full weight of her actions settling on her shoulders like a crushing burden. The woman who had been so confident and angry just minutes before now looked small and broken. She had grown up in a different time, when certain attitudes were more common and accepted. But she knew deep down that this was not an excuse for her behavior. Margaret thought about her own life, her own family, and the values she had tried to instill in her children and grandchildren. She had always considered herself a good person, someone who went to church and donated to charity. But now she was forced to confront the ugly truth about the prejudices she had carried in her heart. For so long, slowly, Margaret stood up from her seat and walked the few steps to where Emma was sitting. Her legs felt shaky, and her hands trembled as she approached the woman she had so cruelly attacked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, filled with genuine remorse and shame. "Dr. Thompson," Margaret began, struggling to find the right words. "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong, and I am deeply sorry. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. And I hurt you in the process." Emma looked up at Margaret with eyes that showed no anger or hatred, only compassion and understanding. She saw not an enemy standing before her, but a human being who was capable of growth and change. This was the same grace Emma had shown to difficult patients and their families throughout her career. "Thank you for your apology, Margaret," Emma said softly. "I accept it. We all have room to grow and learn." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she continued speaking. "My own granddaughter has a heart condition. If something happened to her, I would want the best doctor possible to save her life, regardless of what they look like. I realize now how foolish and hurtful my behavior was." Emma reached out and gently touched Margaret's hand, a gesture of forgiveness that surprised everyone in the cabin. "Perhaps this experience will help you see people differently from now on. That is all any of us can hope for." The atmosphere in the cabin transformed completely after this exchange. What had been a place of tension and conflict became something closer to a community. Tom Williams, the brave teenager who had spoken up, moved to sit closer to Emma and asked her about her journey to becoming a surgeon. He was fascinated by her story of overcoming poverty and discrimination to achieve her dreams. William Peterson, the retired teacher who had been the first to stand up for Emma, shared tales of his own teaching career and how he had learned to challenge his own biases over the years. He spoke about students who had taught him as much as he had taught them, and how working with children from different backgrounds had opened his eyes to the beauty of diversity. Even Margaret engaged in the conversation, asking Emma about her work with children and expressing genuine interest in volunteering at a local hospital. The transformation in her was remarkable to witness, as if the confrontation had broken down walls she had built up over decades. Other passengers joined the discussion as well. Lucy shared stories about her own work with immigrant families, and David talked about how his business had been enriched by hiring people from different backgrounds. The cabin that had been divided by prejudice was now united by understanding and hope. When the plane finally landed in London, Emma was greeted by a crowd of supporters at the airport. Reporters were there to interview her about the upcoming awards ceremony, but she chose to speak about the experience on the plane instead. She talked about how people had stood up for her, and how even someone who had initially shown prejudice had been capable of change. As Emma walked through the terminal, she carried with her not just the memory of discrimination, but also the powerful reminder that good people will stand up for what is right when it matters. Most, she had seen strangers become allies, and she had witnessed the possibility of redemption even in the most difficult circumstances. 2 days later, at the awards ceremony, Emma spoke to an audience of doctors, politicians, and humanitarian workers from around the world. Healing, she said to the packed auditorium, does not just happen in operating rooms. It happens when we choose to see each other as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. It happens when we find the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it is uncomfortable. Margaret Wilson, who had flown back home to her family, watched the ceremony on television from a living room. She had already signed up to volunteer at a local children's hospital, inspired by Emma's example. She was determined to use her remaining years to make up for the prejudice she had shown. Tom William S. went on to study medicine, motivated by Emma's story and his own desire to help others. William Peterson started a community discussion group about overcoming prejudice, using his experience as a teacher to help others examine their own biases, and Emma Thompson continued to work, knowing that each life she saved was a victory not just for medicine, but for the human spirit itself. She had learned that change was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The end.